Beginners often struggle with hand reading. Hand reading is a crucial skill in poker, and what I find beginners often do, pay way too much attention to their hand and the board, how much they like their hand, or they just put their opponent on one hand. You know, their opponent raises pre-flop and then bets queen 7-3, bets the deuce turn, and they're like, well, I put him on ace-king, because they know ace-king is a hand he'd play pre-flop, and so that's it. And they kind of hope he has ace-king. Hand reading is much more complex than that. You need to follow the way that your opponent has played across each street, and each time think about the types of hands that he would do that with, types of hands that he would not do that with. Hand reading is a multi-street process. Now, if you're a beginner, you're not supposed to go from 0 to 100. You're supposed to kind of work your way up to this and start hand reading a little bit as the hand goes on, but not all the way. So the way I'd suggest you do that by observing the hands that you're not involved in, because when you're involved in the hand, you have so much to process regarding your hand, the board, the bets that are going in, whether you want to bet or check. There's a lot to think about already. As you progress in poker, as you play a lot more poker, those things become not automatic. Some of them become automatic, but some of them also just become much faster, and you have more capacity, more mental bandwidth to also process hand reading, to also process tells. Focus on hands that you are not involved in, and think when one opponent bets the river, what kind of value hand are they saying that they have? Would they have checked the flop with that hand? Would they have bet the turn with that hand, or would they have gone for a check raise? Just think through. The more practice you get, the better you're going to be, the more automatic it becomes. Focus on a lot of the hands that you're not involved in. Not only will you get that practice in hand reading, but you'll actually get information on your opponents when they show down their hands or when they don't show down their hands, because you're actually paying attention. Most of us do not pay attention once we fold. Beginners often struggle with bluffing. It's a broad category, and people struggle in different ways. Some people just bluff every time they have a missed draw. Some people never bluff, and everything in between. A really important aspect of bluffing is understanding your value range. And this is essentially hand reading yourself. Given what I did pre-flop, given the way the boards run out, how many hands do I have that would bet for value? And what size would I bet those hands? Oftentimes people will get to the river, they have a weak hand, they're like, I can't win unless I bet, so I bet. And they don't even think about what bet size to use. Or they think, well, I want them to fold, so I'm gonna bet really big. Or they'll think, well, I don't wanna risk a lot, so I'll bet really small. People do different things. The way that you should really decide how much to bet with your bluffs is, what's the most common value hand that I have in this spot? And what would I bet with that hand? That's exactly what I should bet with my bluffs, so that my opponents can't pick up on the differences. A very important skill that beginners struggle with is bankroll management. It's really key. Whether you are a recreational player who is just playing for fun, you need to then decide how much you're willing to lose and are comfortable losing, so that you're playing in a way that you're enjoying yourself, having fun, and not playing scared to the point where you're actually losing more money than you would be otherwise if you're an underdog in the game. Obviously, some recreational players can be winners in the game too, and then there's even more consideration then to making sure you have an edge, because you have a good mindset and you're in a good state of mind because you're playing in a level you're very comfortable with, etc. Now, if you're looking to play professionally or semi-professionally, you need to know how real variance is. There are variance calculators out there. Pokerdope.com has a good one. They will show you just how unlucky it's possible to get and for how long. And spoiler alert, it's longer than you think, and it's more unlucky than you think. Making sure that you're well rolled, not only to withstand those swings, but also to make sure that you play in a good state of mind, that when you lose 5 buy-ins, you're not pulling all your hair out. You're like, okay, well, I'm well prepared for this. I have another 95 buy-ins behind. You know, this is just one long session. This time it didn't go well. I have a lot more sessions to play and make that up. I personally did a very bad job of bankroll management. When I started playing as a total beginner, and I was playing $10 sit and goes with $100. That's 10 buy-ins. You can very easily lose 10 buy-ins, especially if you're a beginner. But yeah, bankroll management solves so many problems. What am I trying to accomplish with insert the next action that I want to take? It's so frequent that players will bet because they have top pair, or check because they have middle pair, or bet because they have a flush draw, or c-bet because they raise pre-flop. And those are not reasons. They are reasons. And if they're your reasons, it's good that you become aware of them and state them either out loud or in an internal monologue. But those are not good reasons. Good reasons to bet or check or call or fold or whatever you may be doing. For example, you could bet to get value, also known as making a worse hand put money in. You could bluff, also known as getting a better hand to fold, or getting a hand with good equity to fold. when it had proper odds to call. You could be in a situation where because of the makeup of your range, you're just supposed to bet everything if you're playing theoretically correct. And then there are other, smaller reasons to bet. Maybe you want some protection with your hand, which I caution you against using too much. Maybe you want to make the hand harder to play for your opponent, which is often a bad reason. Making the hand easier to play for you and harder for your opponent is a reason that people come up with that is not good. However, that often coincides with disguising your hand, keeping your range uncapped, making your opponent define their hand more. And those are actually kind of good reasons. So you're sort of onto something if you're thinking along those lines. But far and away, the most important takeaway here is have a reason for your action. Don't just mindlessly bet. Next up, I think about my range. What is my overall range? By that, real quick, for those who aren't familiar with ranges, I mean, what are all of the hands that I would play up until this point in the hand the same way? Because those are all of the hands that I could have here that my opponent needs to worry about. And not only does my opponent need to worry about, I need to worry about it, because if I'm getting advanced for a second, there's such thing as minimum defense frequency. So in a lot of spots, you want to make sure that you're not exploitable by folding to a bet 90% of the time or folding to a bet 70% of the time. You want to make sure that you're not betting the river 90% of the time in a given spot. There are some rare exceptions where these things are okay, but for the most part, you want to make your opponent indifferent to bluffing or to calling or folding. And what that means is if I'm in a given spot and I know, okay, well, very roughly, by the way, you don't need to know your exact range. Don't worry about that. But I know very roughly I have like high pairs, I have broadways, I have suited connectors. And on this board, when I flop middle pair with 9-8 suited on, let's say, queen 8-4, I'm kind of middle of my range or so. So if my opponent is betting a relatively large sizing and there's nothing particularly interesting about my opponent's range that would make me have to worry about that, kind of at the midpoint between whether it's a fold or a call. This is a very, very super simplification. But knowing your range can not only help you make sure you're not exploitable, but a lot of people find comfort in facing a big bet and not knowing what to do and then just reverting to, okay, well, I know that this is one of the top 10% of hands that I could have here. So if I don't have a read on my opponent, I just need to put in the call with a hand this good and I don't need to worry about it. And similarly, if you're facing a huge bet on the river, you think, well, maybe he's bluffing, maybe he's not, but I don't have a good guess. And this hand is in the bottom 30% roughly of the hands that I have here. So I'm just gonna fold and I'm not exploitable. Next up is your opponent's range. And if you have multiple opponents, their ranges. Similar to the way that you think about your range and all the hands you can have, hand reading is extremely important. So what is the range that my opponent would play up until this point in the same way that they've played this hand? This is where you can go from kind of basic hand reading to really advanced stuff, where if you have a good idea of your opponent's range and you know, for example, this opponent's really likely to fold if he doesn't have middle pair or better. And based on the range he's played this way, he's going to have middle pair or better only like 25% of the time. So I can bluff with everything. So it's a way to find exploits as well as a way to figure out rough optimal play frequencies. And similarly, if your opponent has played a hand in a certain way and is betting river, and you can think to yourself, well, how many value hands does my opponent have in their range? Well, they have a lot of top pair, they have a lot of two pair, they river some straights with their semi bluffs. And then how many bluffs do they have? Well, they have a couple of missed flush draw combos, but they like to give up with those. And otherwise they just have too much showdown value with this range to bluff. So probably they're not bluffing enough and I should just fold everything. So knowing your opponent's range is the first step in finding great exploits. Yeah, so I've had two mental game coaches throughout my career. Tommy Angelo first, when I started working with him back in 2006. And then more recently, I've worked with Elliot Rowe for several years. They're both fantastic. They're both actually very different in what they teach. Basically, Tommy teaches, parts of how to be professional from his own lived experience and how to be zen about poker as a whole, because it's something he has more or less achieved. Elliot is a lot more of, he's two things. He's a hypnotherapist and performance coach. And then he's also kind of like if you were running a business and you had an executive coach, he's something like that. So the advice is not as general as it is very specific to what you're dealing with. So for Tommy, I'm going to go, this is one that he actually didn't teach me directly. He wrote an article about it. called reciprocality. If you play a hand a certain way and your opponent would play the hand the same way, if roles were reversed, and you would play their hand the same way, they would play your hand the same way, you've gained no money. So yes, you might have gotten aces and they might have had kings, and you might have gotten all in pre-flop and you might have won $2,000 at 5-10 no limit. But in reality, nobody gained an edge because you both played it the way you would have played in each other's shoes. So the concept of reciprocality is that all edges come from you doing something better than what your opponent would have done in your shoes. So the way this applies is it helped get me to stop thinking about, it helped me stop being so focused on the exact situation and result of the hand that I'm in. And it helped me not worry as much about, oh, I lost this big pot with set over set, or, oh, I bluffed here and ran into the nuts, whatever the case may be, because I can think about in terms of kind of expected value and reciprocality of, oh, if my opponent had middle set there, they also would have gone broke. So I didn't actually lose any money there. I really like that approach. It's really just the concept of expected value and your earn, but put in a very eloquent and easy to understand way. So I've always liked that. The lesson that Tommy taught me is that everything has an impact on your edge, and that's actually something you can take advantage of, or that's actually something you can use to your advantage. So the example I think of is Tommy would always come to World Series of Poker during the summer, and Tommy was a cash game player. He didn't play any tournaments, but he loved to play cash games in the afternoons and evenings when the tournaments were running, because he would just be there playing his cash game in his normal mood. And a lot of people would play a tournament. They would bust out of the tournament and they would go head over to the cash games, because that's what you do. If you're a poker player, you don't have another tournament to play, you go play cash games. And he was just there in his normal state. And all of these players were coming from having just had an upsetting loss into his game right there. And so they're already coming in tilted in some capacity. Maybe some don't mind that much. Maybe some are really upset. Maybe some are just, slightly off balance and are going to, fall all the way over. But he's gaining an edge. Again, reciprocality. He's playing with no emotional baggage coming from tournaments, and these players are joining the table at a pretty bad time to play. Now, a lot of these players, just they're pros, they're still, favorites in the game, but he's getting an edge just by not having just dealt with a loss. And there are so many of these things that come up in poker where, with the concept of reciprocality, not just in terms of how hands are played, but in terms of how much preparation you've done, how much sleep you've gotten, what kind of mood you're in, there are a lot of ways to gain an edge, because if your opponent's tired and you're not, that's an edge. If your opponent's upset and you're not, that's an edge. And then the last one, I never use this, but I kind of wanted to. So I've never used this because I have too much trouble. It's not really lying, but lying. But it's a really funny tactic that he uses that I would really like to start using. So basically, when he's playing live poker, a lot of times after a hand, you'll bet the river, your opponent will fold, and they'll be like, did you make a flush? Or, you're bluffing, weren't you? You probably had a missed straight draw. First of all, it's just kind of annoying because you're not going to tell them and you don't want to deal with it. And second of all, if you do start to engage in that and you do tell them, you're actually losing an edge because you're giving them information for free. Now, there's a counter argument to this, which is like, in this conversation, you can get information from them about what they folded and how they think about the game. But anyways, it's still like a kind of something that can wear on you if you're playing a lot. And so what Tommy does is whatever they ask him, he just says yes. Oh, did you make a flush? Yep. And then sometimes they'll be like, oh, did you make a flush? And I'll be like, yep. And they'll ask him another question. Sometimes they'll ask a question that kind of isn't congruent with the first. And he says, yep, again. And then they're confused because it doesn't really make sense. And eventually, after hours of playing, sometimes they realize that he said yes every time that they've asked him if he had a certain hand. But that's something that I've always kind of wanted to do and haven't done. Hopefully you're comfortable doing it, because it does sound relaxing. In college, I was taught about something called the shampoo effect. When you wash your hair with shampoo, you use whatever amount of shampoo, you lather, you rinse. And if you want to shampoo again, only a small amount of shampoo will get you as much lather. They use that to refer to drinking. If you went out one night drinking and you want to drink the next morning, you get drunk pretty quickly off of a couple of drinks. And I think the same thing is true of tilt. It becomes easier for a couple of bad beats to tilt you in a way that it used to take a dozen bad beats to do. So when I realized that, I stopped complaining as much, and he happened to stop complaining as much too. And I do think it genuinely helped. So there's something called a negativity bias. And the way this works, this is not exclusive to poker by any means. It's everywhere. If you've ever had to pick a line at the grocery store, you go into the one that seems the shortest, and then the one next to you that had like one extra person in it is just moving much faster, and it goes right past you. That kind of sticks in your mind, and you start to think,
this always happens to me. Whereas if you get in the shortest line and then it goes the fastest, you don't think anything of it. That's just what was supposed to happen. Same thing happens in traffic. As soon as I move to this lane, that one's going to start moving and this one's going to stop, because those events stick out in your memory more than what is supposed to happen of you move to this lane because it's moving and it keeps moving. That happens everywhere. It can be really detrimental to your mental, emotional well-being. We've all had friends who will say something like, well, with my luck, this is what's going to happen. Why do these things always happen to me? I'm so unlucky. Things like that. I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, those people tend to be people who seem less happy more often. Now, obviously, you could argue that if somebody's having bad thing after bad thing happen to them, they're supposed to be unhappy. A lot of times it's their view of how the world is treating them, in my opinion. Not only can feeling like you're unlucky or being unlucky so many times tilt you more easily, it can also make you shy away from risks, both at the table while you're in a hand. I think this is a shove, but with my luck, I'm going to run into a big hand. I think this is a call, but the flop's going to be nasty for me. I'll just fold now and not have to deal with it. Or off the table in terms of playing in a game that you should because it's making you uncomfortable. You think you won't run well. Although with that specific example, don't play in a game if it's starting to make you feel uncomfortable, usually, because you'll play worse than you would otherwise. It can impact your EV in one way or another. It impacts your happiness level, which, what's more important than that? How do we counteract negativity bias? There are ways to not let it impact you as much. So one of the first is doing kind of the opposite of what my friend and I were doing. Rather than complain about the bad things that happen, celebrate when the good things happen. I'm not one when I'm playing to do either very much naturally, but celebrating the good things happening make those more memorable. And celebration is a good feeling. It makes you feel good. I had a friend who taught me he was trying to help me, taught me a concept, and I just couldn't really execute it because of my personality. But basically what he does is he sets, I feel like it was every 3 hours, what he calls a joy alarm. And so his joy alarm goes off and he sits there and he asks himself some questions. I wish I remember all the questions he asked, but it's something along the lines of, am I financially secure? Do I have people who love me? And he goes through the list, and usually there are things that he does have. And then he essentially celebrates as if, you're in a bar and your team just won. And I couldn't get comfortable with with that. So I didn't incorporate it into my life. I tried a couple times. I'm glad there wasn't a camera on when I was. But the concept stuck with me. And I still tried to, in my own way, in my own less expressive way, celebrate when good things happen to me. Another one is to express gratitude. It's along the same lines, really. You can give thanks in a written form or verbal form to yourself, or, if you pray to God or to the people and things that you're grateful for. I don't know all the scientific reasons why that's so helpful, but if you're expressing gratitude for things and you're celebrating wins, you're going to remember all of the good things that are happening to you more than you would have otherwise. And another one is to do the opposite of what that friend I mentioned earlier does. So this is one that I do. I call myself a lucky person. So let's say that I'm going to buy a piece of somebody who's playing in a big tournament. I'll buy 10% of their action. And I'll say, don't worry, my money's lucky. And I don't actually believe that me investing in them is going to make them more lucky. I like to say it both for myself and why do I like to do that? I mean, objectively, I'm a lucky person. I was born in America to a loving family who are financially secure, who took great care of me. I've had great friends. I've had a great career. I have a great family now. I'm objectively a lucky person, and I know that I'm lucky, and I appreciate all of that. But that doesn't mean that I'm going to be lucky in the future. Yet, I still like to say that I think I will be. And I think it just helps with mindset. It can kind of drag you down if somebody around you is always complaining or always not believing in themselves and not believing good things are going to happen to them. I think it makes me a more pleasant person to be around. So today I'm going to read to you a story that we all know, a classic really, but a story that we were all taught a little bit too late. This is the story of the three little fish and the big bad shark. Once upon a time, there was an old mother fish who had three little fish. As they grew up, she realized there was not enough room in their home aquarium for all of them, so she decided to send them out into the ocean to seek their fortunes. The fish, out on their own for the first time, realized
They were going to have to make a home for themselves. The first little fish built his aquarium out of preflop charts. They were easy to find, basically lying around everywhere. And they were simple to build with. You just stick them together and there you are. He was proud he finished his new home so quickly, which left him plenty of time to give his 2 cents on the latest and greatest poker drama on Twitter. The second little fish built his aquarium out of blind aggression. It was intimidating, which he knew would keep others out. Plus, it was pretty easy. He threw it together in a matter of hours. Together, the first 2 fish made fun of their brother, the third little fish, who had always been diligent, calculating, thorough. He worked tirelessly on his aquarium, making small improvements that, frankly, seemed pointless to his brothers. "I can't believe he's still working on that thing," they teased their brother. "We finished ours weeks ago, and he's supposed to be the smart one." Laser focused on his studies, the third fish didn't even bother to respond. One day, the big, bad shark sailed past the aquariums and saw the first little fish inside, hiding behind his basic preflop charts. Thinking it would make a mighty meal, the shark tapped on the glass and said, little fish, let me in." But the little fish saw the shark's flashing teeth through the keyhole and said, "No way, Mr. Shark, I won't give in." The shark said, "Then I'll tap, and I'll tap, and I'll crack your walls down." And so the shark tapped harder and harder. And within seconds, the first little fish's fragile little strategy cracked and crumbled. As his home came crashing down, the first little fish rushed to the safety of his brother's aquarium. The second fish told him not to worry. No fish he'd ever come across had gotten through his blind aggression. "You'll be safe in here," he said. The big bad shark followed his prey to home number 2. He tapped the glass and said, little fish, let me in." The 2 fish replied, "No way, Mr. Shark, we won't give in." The shark warned them again, "Then I'll tap, and I'll tap, and I'll crack your walls down." The shark tapped, and the glass tapped back. The shark rammed into the glass as hard as he could and was thrown backwards. He'd never run into this kind of aggression before. So the shark reevaluated and came up with a plan. He tapped the glass and then quickly moved out of the way and waited. Soon enough, the glass began to shake. The aggression was pushing back with nothing to push against. After a while, it shattered into a million little pieces, and the 2 fish fled to the safety of the third aquarium. The big bad shark chased the 2 fish down the reef and almost caught them, but they made it inside the third fish's home. The 2 little fish were very frightened, thinking that the shark wanted to eat them, and that was very true. However, the third little fish had spent many weeks preparing for the big bad shark. He didn't build his aquarium out of a single material, like preflop charts or aggression. The third fish laid a foundation of theoretical knowledge. He built up from there, adding balanced ranges, patience, and empathy. He tacked on hand reading, proper bet sizing, a strong mindset. He applied bankroll management. He prioritized sleep, worked on his health. He never bet for comfort to make the hand easier to play. He didn't make plays based on emotion, yet he didn't try to stuff his emotions down either. He accepted his feelings, and he made the right plays in spite of them. He thought through every play that he made, trying to understand the why behind both his actions and the actions of his opponents. He found enough turn check raises on each and every board, which is really difficult. He did not chase losses. He quit when he needed to quit. He never left his range vulnerable to being run over at any point. He never lent anybody money, and he didn't play on ultimate bet. That's what his house was made out of. Still, the big bad shark tapped on the glass and said, little fish, let me in." The 3 fish replied in unison, "No way, Mr. Shark, we won't give in." "Then I'll tap, and I'll tap, and I'll crack your walls down." The shark tapped, and he tapped harder, but no matter how hard he tapped, the aquarium stood strong. He tried tapping every wall of it, looking for a leak anywhere, but not even the tiniest crack appeared. The big bad shark was enraged. After an hour of trying, he turned away with his head hung down. Not only would he be left hungry, but he had been beaten. Just as the shark was about to swim away, he heard a door open behind him. It was the third fish with 2 powerful weapons in his fins, the harpoon of balance and the mindset net. The third fish had spent so much time preparing himself against an attacker that he had become a hunter himself. The fish captured the shark in his net, and the shark began to pout, little fish, let me out." The first two little fish looked up to their big brother. They understood now what he was doing all of those hours and days. They wanted to become a hunter just like him, though, as it would turn out, they'd never wanted enough to put in the work. The end. Or is it the beginning? Today is the day that you decide what the rest of your life is going to look like. Do you want to be weak, or do you want to be strong? Do you want to be prey, or do you want to be a predator?